Commissioner's Cup final is today, and who better to take us through what it all means, especially for the Minnesota Lynx, than Kent Youngblood, who I always learn from, and now so will you. Locked On Women's Basketball starts now.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Everyone, and welcome to Locked On Women's Basketball. I'm your host, Howard Megdal, and I want to thank you for making us your first listen every day. You guys keep showing up for us, over 350,000 of you in May alone. Gonna have to run the numbers on June, but they are not lower than we show up for you 6 days a week, along with, of course, as you've started to notice, our team-specific podcasts as well. So make sure you're subscribing if you haven't yet over at YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. It is not just me. It is the incredible team across the board at The Next, thenexthoops.com. We have over 100 reported pieces every single month on the past, present, future of women's basketball. Make sure you get it all into your email inbox. $9 a month, $72 a year at thenexthoops.com. And it's a big day. It's Commissioner's Cup final day. The Minnesota Lynx taking on the Indiana Fever. The Minnesota Lynx feature, of course, Napheesa Collier as their signature star. Indiana, Kent, maybe you can help me. Is there a big-time star on the Indiana Fever who a lot of people are talking about?
Yeah, but there's a star that everybody's talking about that might not play tonight.
So what are you hearing right now? We've got, Kent, we're going to talk all Commissioner's Cup here right away. Later on, getting into bigger picture questions about the Lynx and also about Kent's career, which I'm really excited to examine and dive into as well. But Kent, what's the latest on Caitlin Clark?
Well, she's listed as questionable. Coach White has been pretty strong in saying they're not going to jeopardize her immediate future to try to get on the court. And while this is a very high-profile event, this is an 8-8 team that's still kind of fighting for an identity and looking for a playoff spot. I don't know that they would, if there's a question, I don't know if they would push it to get her on the court for a game that won't matter in the standings. So we'll find out probably 15 minutes before the game starts. They'll probably say she's got to warm up or something or some such. But if I was personally betting right now, I'd say she will not play.
It's interesting that you talk about it within the broader framework of the Indiana Fever, because this has not been a season that's gone according to plan here in year two. We've seen Caitlin miss a couple of different segments due to injury. We have seen the fact that DeWanna Bonner, who was a high-profile free agent, did not work out and is no longer a member of the Indiana Fever. Just from your perspective on the Fever side, how important is this game? Like you said, it doesn't count in the standings. It does count in terms of there is a trophy involved. There's some financial incentive as well. How do you see them treating it right now?
I don't have a super amount of insight into how the Fever is treating it, but I mean, as training camp was starting, everybody was kind of looking at the Fever. At least I was, and saying they hired a great coach, just a proven track record coach. They got the Rookie of the Year, a generational player. They made some nice moves, I thought, for agency. I've always been a big fan of Natasha Howard's too. This team really, really seems set, and it just hasn't worked out for a number of reasons. I'm not close enough to the Indiana situation to know exactly what happened with Bonner, but that was a big loss. Veteran leadership. She's not what she was, 10 years ago, but she can still hit a three, and she's a valuable player. But Mitchell and Boston are probably better than they were last year. Lexi Hull is better than she was last year. If this team had stayed healthy, I think they'd be a lot better than 8-8 right now. And I still think they have the potential, once they get healthy, to be a top half team in this league.
For all the things you just mentioned, This is still a team that you go by net rating, they're fifth in the league out of 13. And the idea in my mind, and we talked about this on the podcast previously, is top four is kind of the floor of where they need to be to make the progress from last year, where the goal was you have to make the playoffs, and they did, and they made the playoffs. And so they're right there. They're right there in terms of overall performance. To go in and beat Minnesota would be a real opportunity to show some confidence, but especially on the defensive side of the ball, the defense. And that's part of why Stephanie White was brought in, was to shore that up. They are seventh defensively right now overall. They're actually better defensively when Caitlin Clark is off the floor. Now, not better offensively, and that's not
net.
Right. That's right. And so are there particular areas that you're looking for that Indiana needs to stop Minnesota if they're to win this game today?
Well, Minnesota has, in my opinion, shown a vulnerability in defending in the paint. I think that Indiana would seem fairly well equipped to take advantage of that. I think that would be really big. They have to defend the Lynx on the perimeter. The Lynx are starting to heat up as a three-point shooting team led by Kayla McBride, who I think moved into seventh place all time last game in three-pointers made, passing Chrissy Tolliver. But to me, you talk about how important this game is, and it doesn't count in the standings, but a number of Lynx players told me over the last couple of days that when the Lynx went to New York last year and beat the Liberty in that championship game, it was a watershed moment for them, because that was the moment at which they knew that they could be a great team. And it's kind of hard to quantify that, but when you start to believe that on a certain level, you look at the way they finished the season. I think they were 13-1 after the Olympic break. That is important. I think that coming in here and beating a 14-2 team on their home court would go a long ways to maybe putting them on a path that they feel they should be on.
And that speaks directly to me, to the point we'll get to in our next round of questions. It's about how good the Lynx are. Again, we're asking these questions not because Indiana is the focus, but because there are fewer questions in my mind, and I suspect in yours, about this Minnesota team than any other team in the league right now. To be 14-2, to be first overall in not just net rating, but if you break down the component parts to it, offensive rating and defensive rating as well. There's a Minnesota team that very much seems to know who they are. You have always found where there's capacity for improvement as well, to go along with it, rather than sort of a blind positivity that goes along with this team. But from your perspective, could Minnesota's season have started any better than it has?
Well, it's interesting. They're what, 2.5 games clear now of every other team in the league.
Yep.
And in my mind, they've played 2 games so far, wire to wire, where they were good. They've only played 2 complete games in my mind, and the last one being beating a pretty bad Connecticut team by the 39 points,
39.
which is the third biggest victory in the history of the franchise. They're 14-2 despite Collier missing a handful of games with a couple of injuries. They're 14-2 despite the fact that Courtney Williams has at times been great and at times been kind of bewilderingly not great. And they lost their backup to Katie Samuelson to a foot injury that doesn't look like she's going to be back anytime soon.
Yeah.
So I think I guess that's what I'm saying is they're 14-2, and there's enormous room for improvement in my mind. Their defense has been there pretty much start to finish, but their offense has been, almost every game there's been a quarter where you just kind of looked at them and said, what is going on with their offense? If the scary thing is that if they start playing more consistently, they could be even better.
Yeah. And again, in a league where the the Liberty, after an equally strong start, have come back to earth, critically missing John Paul Jones and Leo Fibich. Be very interesting to see where they are at full strength once JJ returns. But it's a lead where it's hard to argue that anyone's in a better position to ultimately win the WNBA title this year than Minnesota is. So I want to dive deeper into that here after the break about where the Lynx are headed and where those areas of improvement can come. So no one knows that better than Kent Youngblood, who joins us. We'll be talking more. I'm Howard Megdal. You're listening to Locked On Women's Basketball. But first, Locked On Women's Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel, and summer sports are in full swing. Not just the WNBA. There's Major League Baseball, which is professional baseball. There is soccer going on, not just National Women's Soccer League, but there's also a men's league called MLS. Golf is happening, not just the LPGA, but also with the PGA. And FanDuel has you covered for every single game. With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. Go to use FanDuel right now. They have daily promotions, new fun ways to bet. There's same game parlays, or even just watching a bet ride the entire game. FanDuel makes you feel like you're part of the action. If you're new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get 150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Back here with Kent Youngblood. How long are we talking? You've been covering sports and women's basketball?
Well, I started covering the Lynx in 2013. So I was there for their second, third, and fourth titles.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think 5 championship appearances. So it's been a while, and I've covered the Gophers women's basketball team since about 2018.
It's exciting to talk about the history, and we'll get into that as well. Which I'm just.
But I'm really going to miss you.
Sorry, we had some people into the press room. They didn't know I was on it.
People listen, but that's how everyone feels. And we're going to talk about your legacy of coverage too, Kent, because listen, in Rare Gems, which are right above my shoulder, I quoted you. You were a guide for so much of this, so I'm appreciative. But let's talk. I do too. Let's talk Lynx first. 14-2, tops in the league in all these areas. Now, I think the only two people who see a chance for the Lynx to get better are you and Cheryl Reeve. But that said, what are you seeing? What is Cheryl seeing? What are you seeing as those areas? How do you get there in essence?
Well, I think this is only my opinion, but as the league has risen in kind of popularity and eyes and investment and expectations, frankly, there was an enormous amount of change in this league between last year and this year. I mean, so many new coaches, many of whom had never been in this league. Lots of player movement. And I think it takes time for teams that have experienced great change and maybe have coaches in the league for the first time to acclimate. The Lynx basically ran it back with a team that made it to the finals last year and made no changes to their starting 5. And so I think they had an advantage out of the gate in this league in terms of hitting the ground running. Now, I think as the season goes on, I think there's a lot of really good coaches in this league. I think there's been a lot of injuries. As the season goes on, I think you're going to see a tightening at the top of the standings. I mean, there's no way that Las Vegas can continue playing like this. I know they're not a deep team, but they're better than this. New York will get healthy and they'll get better. Mm-hmm. I think Phoenix is a tremendous team. So right now, I think they took advantage of the familiarity that they had within their roster and the continuity that they had. And now they're going to have to, I think, reach to a higher level to improve. And I think they can. I think they can be a more consistent team.
continuity in this league, as you know, is everything. I'm obviously you have to have the talent, but I guess the thing I wonder, and I don't know if there's an answer to this, and other than we simply have to see the season play out, is whether the head start in continuity Minnesota has, and I would argue New York has, is more than anyone can overcome. That's, we talked about Indiana in segment one, but that's the biggest thing for me coming in was wondering, gee, how do you balance Lexi Hull and DeWanna Bonner and get those minutes? And the answer was no easy answer to that. You're incorporating Natasha Howard. There are new ways in which Sid Colson is another example. And these are vets, and these are vets with championship experience, but you still need the group to come together. Isn't that just kind of a difference maker for these two finalists from last year?
I do believe that. And, I like to describe the Lynx as a team that is greater than the sum of its parts.
Mm-hmm.
But before I really kind of get into that, you have to realize, Napheesa Collier, every year she's played in this league, she's been better than the year before. Every year, with the exception, obviously, of the year she took off, essentially, to have her daughter, right? I don't know what the word is. She is, to me, one of the greatest superstars I've ever covered because she's a nice person. She's a great teammate. She is just not about her. She's about team. And I always believe that the greatest teams in this league, in any league, in any sport, take on the personality of their best player.
Mm-hmm.
And this team has taken on the personality of Napheesa Collier. They lead the league in assists. I think they assist on an absurd, almost 80% of their baskets are assisted. This is a team that plays as a group and doesn't really care who, is the leading scorer on any given night, although it's usually Napheesa Collier.
Right.
That is the way to play in the women's game of basketball, where you can't take two steps and dunk the ball. You have to work as a team to get good shots. This team gets a lot of good shots.
Do you think, and again, to just get a little bit into the weeds on the numbers, she's become a better and a more efficient shooter, even as she's taking more and more shots. She's north of 56% from two now. She's at almost 40% from three, taking the most three-point attempts of her career. The free throw shooting percentage, she's
94% almost.
Elena Deladon-esque 94%.
Well, she and Kayla McBride are two of the best free throw shooters in this league.
It's not a small thing at the end of a close game.
No,
playoff time.
How many scorers in this league? I'm talking scorers have that kind of efficiency that Napheesa Collier has.
Nobody.
You just don't see it.
No.
No.
We're looking at a 50, 40, 90 player operating largely out of the post.
Yeah. Well, in 2000, I want to say 14, which I think of the year Maya Moore won the MVP. She was 2 or 3 free throws missed away from being a 50, 40, 90 player.
Right.
But she was a much different player. Now she took more threes. But Collier is amazingly efficient for the usage that she has. I think
and north of 22% assist percentage.
Yep. And she leads this team in deflections. She's a great rebounder. And obviously defensive player of the year reigning. And let's say, what is it that she can't do? What is, I don't
know, be rude to reporters.
Is there anybody even close?
That's like the only thing.
Is there anybody even close to her in terms of MVP at this point of the season?
She was the first vote on my All-Star ballot, and she's clearly the MVP right now. If I'm placing that vote right now, now with a long season to go, but that it's clearly where she is. And again, man, Cheryl got her with the 6th pick. Just pretty good.
I wrote a story for today, just talking about you got the top 2 vote getters in the All-Star game were Caitlin Clark and Napheesa Collier, both great players. I'm a big Caitlin Clark fan.
Yeah.
But one person kind of worked 6 years to get to this point, right?
Mhm.
Another person walked into the league with this kind of popularity. It's both it's just kind of interesting juxtaposition plus a comment on just the impact that Clark has had on this league.
Yeah.
But I mean, they were the top 2 vote getters, but have very, very different paths to being captain of an all-star team, right?
It's crazy to be a UConn player and be under the radar, but that's what
Well, she was
Napheesa Collier
though. I
was in
mean,
college. Yeah.
everybody was like, can she shoot the three? Is she a little undersized for the post? Can she defend? Well, I guess the answer would be yes.
It would appear to be yes. And
I think she
Brent,
scored 27 points in her first game.
yeah, she proved it right away and continues to do so. Well, you've told the stories of Napheesa Collier and so many others so well. So we're going to come back after this and talk about your history because you had a big announcement as well. And so back with Kent Youngblood right after this. I'm Howard Megdal. You're listening to Locked On Women's Basketball. Howard Megdal here, Locked On Women's Basketball. And I'm here with Kent Youngblood. And I just think it's important. I went back and I want you to tell me if I'm wrong about this, but I have you as on the staff of the Star Tribune in 1985. You're listed under statistics. You got your
Yeah.
first byline, as I'm seeing, in November of 1985 about a high school girls swimming contest.
Yeah.
Is that's the record? Is that dovetail with your memory of when and how you started writing for the Star Tribune?
I started the Star Tribune in '82 as when I was still in college, just answering phones and taking prep scores.
Yeah.
And then I kind of moved on working on the desk. And then I kind of decided I really wanted to be more of a writer. So my sports editor at the time was kind enough to give me 1 or 2 times a week writing assignments. I actually came up with this idea to do a weekly story called Where Have They Gone, where I tried to track down old athletes, and actually had one of the greatest interviews I ever had was for that series with Ralph Branca. I had breakfast with
Oh.
Ralph Branca, you know.
Just for the listeners who may not know, and apologies in advance, Brooklyn Dodger fans, if you're listening, Ralph Branco, of course, gave up the home run to Bobby Thompson, the shot heard around the world, October 3rd, 1951.
Yes.
The Giants win the pennant. You've heard, I'm sure, Russ Hodges talk about this in that moment. Branca, a great pitcher, won 20 games actually in the
Yes.
season prior to that, but was largely ruined in many ways after. But just to talk to Branca, that must have been amazing.
Well, he actually had a great anecdote. He said he talked about how that hurt his life and how it ruined his. I mean, it was a catastrophe, and it stuck with him for a long time. And then he said one day, Bobby Thompson called him up. He said, "I have an idea." He said, "Let's take a picture of that shot, make 1,000 copies,
Mm-hmm.
sign them, and we'll sell them." And he made like $1 million. And he said, "I got over it." But anyway, so I worked at the Star Tribune primarily on the desk until 1990. Then I went to the State Journal in Madison, Wisconsin. I covered the Packers into the '98 season, 2 Super Bowls, 1 win, and then came back to the Star Tribune to cover the Vikings for 5-6 years. And I covered the Timberwolves and the Wild. And then I started covering the Lynx in 2013.
So 2 things about this, right? Yes, all of that is true. In some ways that sort of undersells how much you've done in women's sports and women's basketball specifically, because again, you cover everything at the Star Tribune during that period of time. I'm going back in the midst of doing my book research, and you were writing about Lindsay Whalen as an undergraduate. You were writing about Lindsay Whalen when she was first redefining what women's basketball could be in Minnesota. And so can you just kind of take me through when you get that Lynx beat? And I know I know there is an understanding at the highest levels with the Lynx of the value of your coverage, the value of the everyday coverage, the value of the depth of coverage. Did you know what that was going to mean at the time you joined the Lynx beat officially 12 years ago now?
No, what's interesting is when I was young and I was so ambitious, it's like I really wanted to cover the highest profile stuff.
Right.
I wanted to cover the NFL badly, right? And I got to do that at a time when access was much better than it is now.
Mm-hmm.
But as the walls started going up in particularly men's sports, it became less fun because, and so I made a transition from, I want to cover something that I can actually cover. Do you understand? Where I can actually make relationships, actually tell stories. And I don't care what anybody else thinks about how high or low profile it is. I was very drawn to the WNBA because it was good people, it was a good product, and you could reach people and get to know them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I found covering the Lynx during that championship era to be incredibly rewarding because you got to see the inside sometimes, right?
Right.
I mean, one of my strongest memories is being in the basement of Williams Arena where they played the 2017 finals because Target Center was being renovated. And that is where Lindsay had played college ball.
That's right.
And they had just won their 4th title. And I went down into the locker room. You can go in the locker room back then, by the way.
That's true.
And Lindsay Whalen was in there with a champagne bottle in both hands, alternating drinking from one and then the other. And she goes, Kent, this is the first time I ever drank alcohol in Williams Arena. And then she said, at least as long as anybody knows about. At least that anybody knows about. I mean, that's the kind of off the cuff stuff you get when you have relationships with people, right?
Correct.
And it's interesting is that I'm about to retire now. And it's coming at a time where the walls are very slowly but steadily being built in the WNBA because profile is raising. There is more of an entourage. There's more desire to insulate. And it's one of the great things is that women's basketball is entering the mainstream. But one of the sad things is that as far as the way they deal with the media, it's entering the mainstream.
Right.
So I don't think it's quite as rewarding as it once was.
No, I understand all of that. And notwithstanding the fact that if you had stayed on the NFL side, you never would have been able to cover a championship in Minnesota. So
no, but I covered a Super Bowl champion in Green Bay.
That is true.
So I got to do that.
Yes. But just to your point about this, I also feel that you are in a market here that has understood the value of it. Cheryl Reeve is somebody who walks the walk, doesn't just talk the talk about, hey, there's more women's sports coverage. We've all been in that place where we should have more coverage. And then the basics to make that happen don't happen. Being able to cover an accessible star, like Lindsay Whalen, someone like a Sylvia Fowles, like a Maya Moore,
Sylvia Fowles, by the way, one of the greatest human beings to ever play in this league.
One of the greatest human beings, period. Exactly. Yeah. And so, how much do you think that also has played a part in not just your experience, but the fact that Minneapolis as a whole has come to understand what they have in the Lynx and, building
I mean, winning every other year over how many year stretch probably contributed to that.
Yes.
But, this is just my opinion, but especially early on in my time covering this league, there was an awful lot of fanish coverage of women's basketball by people who felt like it was very important to promote the sport rather than necessarily just cover it. And I understand that because there was a long ways to go as far as acceptance from the general public, the profile of the sport. But when I started covering the team, one of the things I wanted to do was basically just cover the Lynx like a beat, like I covered every other team I'd ever covered like a beat. And that meant showing up every day that that there was access, even if I wasn't writing, getting to know people that I could get to know, and writing what happened, and that meant good or bad. Now, in the years I covered the Lynx, there wasn't a lot of bad to write about, you know. But one of there's a moment, relatively early in my time covering the Lynx where Reva had always said, "We'll know that we've arrived when we're covered the same way that the men are." And I wrote something once that she wasn't very happy with, and she reads everything, says she doesn't. She took issue with it, and I said, "Congratulations, Shirley, you're being covered just like the men. You've arrived." And she laughed and moved. I mean, she's been a great person. She's been a great person to cover. But the point is that I always just simply tried to cover the Lynx way I'd covered everything else I'd ever covered in my life.
And it showed. And if you'll forgive me saying so, I don't mean to embarrass you and put you on the spot, but I always learn from your coverage because it is real, because it is done in the way that does not pull any punches. And I've always been very fortunate when we've had the chance to interact and cross paths in press rooms. And so I'm always grateful for it. I'm just going to point out maybe the best example of "I told you so" anyone's ever had. This is from Monday, April 11th, 2011, just before the 2011 draft. And you have a byline on a piece, "Drafting high, achieving low," where you say the following: "Here is a possible lineup: Whalen at point, and Augustus at shooting guard, Moore at small forward, and Rebecca Brunson, one of the league's better rebounders, at power forward. Veteran Taj McWilliams-Franklin, part of that 2008 Shock title team, was signed as a free agent to play center, although she is 40," as part of a piece talking about better days ahead for the Minnesota Lynx. We all know, of course, 2011, 2013, 2015, 2017. It is all followed. Kent, we could do this all day. Unfortunately, we are up against and out of time, but a huge thank you to you for sharing your time here today, and a congratulations for just an incredible run at the Star Tribune. To our listeners, we will be back with you tomorrow, as we are 6 days a week. Until then, I'm Howard Megdal, wishing all of you a wonderful Tuesday. Enjoy the Commissioner's Cup.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.